So grateful for this morning on this Pastor Appreciation Sunday for us. All month is Pastor Appreciation Month, and so what a great opportunity for us to honor the pastors in our lives. And I too have pastors in my life, and even though I'm the lead pastor here, I get to honor them and remind myself of how God has used them to bless me. This morning we're coming back to our message series that we're calling Inception. We started it 6 weeks ago, and I really have seen God continue to speak to us through this, and in it we've been discovering the dream God has for us as individuals and for us as a church. We're discovering, what is that dream? What has God put before us as a church? What dream has He put in us as families? Specifically, as we've been talking about this idea of reaching future generations today. And that is part of the underlining foundation for us of this series, is that truthfully we are reaching future generations today. That is our heart. That is our desire, is to reach beyond just the here and the now, but to reach into the future and be able to reach future generations. That's what we've been talking about. Now, specifically for us as a church, as we think through that idea, we're talking about developing a multi-purpose building here on site. And doing that, we started talking about the God of the dream. That this dream, let me just say this, it's God's dream. It's not my dream. It's not necessarily even our dream, although we get to be a part of it. But at the end of the day, it's God's dream. And He's the God of the dream. And from the very beginning, since inception, God has had a plan. He's had a purpose that He's been working out in our lives. We've got to know that. In fact, we're not going to read it this morning, but in Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1, we go back to the beginning of the Bible, and we see that God laid out a plan of creation, that He had a plan. Since inception, God has had a plan. We can know that not only on this macro level of how God created the universe, but we can also know that to be true in our own lives personally, that God knows our lives. He knows our story. He knows our coming and our going, our past, our present, and the thing that rocks us all, our future. And He has a plan and a purpose for our lives. And so we could trust in that. Now, we talked about throughout this series, and even in the beginning, we talked about that the fact that we're living a dream within a dream within a dream. In other words, we're a part of a dream of somebody that had a dream, of somebody that was a part of somebody else's dream, and so on and so forth. And we can keep on that all the way back to the God of creation, and certainly through all the way to the New Testament, the God of, through Christ Himself. And we can see that play out. In fact, Pastor Micah did an incredible job last week as we talked about living and existing in the dream of a previous generation. Specifically, he talked about living in the dream that Jesus shared with His disciples in John chapter 17. How many of you appreciate Pastor Micah and the amazing word that he brought last week? I know for me, it was an unexpected time away. It was an unexpected time for me to have to step away to Taos and see family. And just let me give an update about that. My sister-in-law had a real challenging health situation. And so the gravity of it is that it ended up where her husband had to perform CPR and mouth-to-mouth to make sure that she lived. And so it was a really dire situation. But how many of you know that we serve a God of healing and power and grace? And she's well today. In fact, we saw her hours later. We got the call early Friday morning. We were there Friday afternoon, and it's almost like if nothing happened. And so we're thanking God for that. But now we're asking God for wisdom, because even though in that moment we know that God is healing her and has healed her, and we're praying for that, there's no clear indication of what caused her situation. And so we're praying and we're believing, but we know that our God is a God of healing. Amen? And so I want to thank Pastor Micah for covering, and I want to thank God for healing Cheryl and continuing to work in her life. Now, let me just say, next week we'll be wrapping up this series. It's hard to believe that it's already 8 weeks in. We're on week 7. We've had 6 weeks of this. We're on week 7 today. And tomorrow, or next Sunday rather, will be week number 8. We'll be wrapping up with what we're calling Commitment Sunday. And in doing so, we're praying through this vision that God has laid before us, this dream that God has laid before us. And part of that is we have 2 distinct financial goals with it. If you've not taken the time, you can go to our website, junctioncommunity.church, and you can see the plans, the progress, the purpose behind what we're doing. You can see it all laid out there. If you have the Junction Community Church app, it's really easy. You can open the app, and there's an icon there for the building project, and you can get the information there. But ultimately, we have two financial goals. One, to raise a $100,000 cash budget, and then a pledge budget over a 2-year period of $150,000. Now, there's a lot to explain with that. We'll talk more about it next week, and the website explains it more than I can do that right now. But I really want to encourage you to spend the week praying about how God will lead you to give. And so I want to encourage you to pray about that. I have a real sense of peace about this because I know that these goals are really big goals, but at the end of the day, we serve a really big God. Amen? And the peace I have is that this is not something that I have to do all by myself, because that's impossible. And it's really ultimately, number one, up to God. And then collectively, we get to be a part of this. We get to be a part of a dream that is bigger than any one of us. And so just as an update, I want to say that not only do I believe that we can do this, but God is already doing it. And in fact, it's already happening. For our $100,000 budget, I just want you to know we've already raised $15,500 towards our cash budget so far. Let's praise God for that. And so we're already inching closer to that. We're believing God for it. And all I would say is let's pray and let's believe God together. And let's see what he would do. And today I want to talk a little bit about not just looking back at how we're existing in the dream of Christ, or we're existing in the dream of future or past generations, but I want to talk specifically about how you and I are really preparing ourselves for a future generation, that we're going to live out a dream that future generations will live out, rather. And so the underpinning idea, as I've said this morning, of this message series is reaching future generations today. And we really start to process that. I believe that we will see God move in us in such a way that future generations will be blessed because of the sacrifices and the contribution that we're making today. I believe that future generations, will be blessed because of our vision in this season of our lives. And as a result of our collective efforts, that future generations will be blessed because of it. How many of you are believing that that will be the case? If so, let's give God praise for that this morning. So as a reminder, when we look to the Bible, we discover that God worked from one generation to the next. We've been discovering this. We've been unpacking this. We've been realizing that God takes and works in one generation, and he continues to work through to the next generation, and so on and so forth. We see that happen. We've talked about that throughout this series. If you missed any of the messages, you can always go back and watch those through our YouTube channel, or you can do it through the Junction Community Church app. But at the end of the day, we see that God is a God that works from one generation to the next. It's throughout the Bible. We see it throughout the biblical narrative, throughout the biblical history. We see that God worked in one generation throughout to the next. In fact, we see many promises that God spoke to one generation fulfilled in the next generation. That the generation that experienced the promise of God didn't always see the fulfillment of that promise. Many times it was much further in the future. And so the same could be said for us in our lives today, that God is fulfilling in us a promise he's spoken to previous generations in our past. I see that as a church, that in 1931, God spoke to a group of people about starting a church here in Grand Junction, 1931. And God, from generation to the next, has continued to work in and through a generation of people, and I believe that that work will continue in and through our lives and after we're all long gone, right? And so that's what God has been doing. He's been working in previous generations. And Pastor Mike had talked a little bit about this last week, and how just our ancestry and how we're, our heritage and where we come from. And I was thinking about that a lot this past week, because I actually drove through there. And I think about this because just a brief history on this a little bit is that my great-great-great-grandfather, his name was Pedro. Vote for Pedro, you know what I'm saying? That was his name. And so that was his name, Pedro Espinoza. And he settled into the southern part of Colorado And in fact, there was a time and a season where there was a schoolhouse, there was, of course, a church house, and there was a general store that had a post office in it, and it was a small little town. Still today, many of my family members, both in my great aunt and then cousins of mine, they own that property. They own that land still, several acres and multiple acres, hundreds of acres they still own in that area. Now, I don't know, I've never, none of my direct ancestors, if you will, were pastors. In fact, many of them were not even churched. They weren't in church at all. But what I have to believe is that somewhere in the line of my heritage and my lineage, that there was a man of God and a woman of God who prayed for me. And if nothing else, I know Jesus prayed for us, right? But here's the truth. I have to believe that back in that time, I don't know if great-great-grandfather Pedro was a believer, but there was a church, so there was somehow a connection. And what I have to know is that even if he wasn't a believer, he was one of the people that contributed land or resources to make that happen. And there was somebody who prayed for the great-great-great-grandchildren and even the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Pedro Espinoza, that God would bless them and work in their lives. And I'm thankful that today that prayer affects a kid who grew up in Southern Colorado and is now the pastor of Junction Community Church, right? I thank God every day, because he works in one generation to the next, and I know that the greatest days are still ahead of us, not behind us. And so, thinking of all that, I also know that there's a generation to come, or generations to come, that will be blessed because of us here today. And I want to look at a text in Psalm 78, but before we go there, I briefly want us to understand a little bit about this text. It's written by a gentleman by the name of Asaph. And Asaph writes this series of psalms. There's several of them, and this is right in the middle of his writing. His writing starts in Psalm 73, and it continues on, and he writes these incredible thoughts. But who he was is he was a director of David's choir. And so he was one of the directors. He was a worship leader. And he was a choir director who would lead worship and would, in this liturgical setting, in this gathering of people, he would lead these psalms in worship. And so he wasn't just writing a poem that would be kind of like, you know, an obscure poem in the back somewhere, and people might read it later. No, he was writing a psalm that would be specifically used in a public setting for worship. And it would be one to not only indicate a teaching moment, but it would also be a moment of worship or a moment of song. And so because he was a choir director, we know that he was a lyricist. And so he was not only writing something that would teach in terms of you know, this idea of just simply a teaching, but he was also writing, and so that way it could be a song. And I don't know how it would be sung in today's modern music. You know, I don't know if it would be, you know, of the country variety, you know, or of the hip-hop variety. I don't know. But what I do know is that it is music unto the Lord. And so we get to this psalm. Asaph writes it. He's a choir director. He's a worship leader. And we get into it in Psalm chapter 78 and in verse 1. And really, again, it's a moment of teaching publicly, but it's also a moment of song. Now, I don't know how you would sing this one, you know. My people, hear my teaching, you know. Listen to the words of my mouth. You know, I have no idea what that would have been, or if it would have been like, my people, hear thy teaching. You know, I had no clue what that would be like. But what I do know, it was used for public worship. And it was used for not only teaching, but declaring God's goodness and worshiping the goodness of our God. And so here it is, verse 1, my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. And Asaph is really challenging the people. He's about to say something that is very critical, and he wants them to pay attention. And at any time that we read God's word and we see these indications of moments where we're explicitly told by the author or the writer or the narrator to pay attention, we should pay attention. And that's exactly what he's saying here. He's saying, my people, hear my teachings. Hear what I'm about to say. Listen to the words of my mouth. And then verse 2, he goes on, I will open my mouth with parables. The interesting thing is in the New Testament, Jesus himself mimics this very verse as he often taught in parables. And I love parables because who doesn't love a good story, right? That's why we like movies. That's why we like to read. Some of us enjoy reading, and others of us just enjoy watching and listening. But at the end of the day, parables are powerful. They tell a story, an allegory that does this great job of pointing out a moral truth or a value or something that we can learn. And so he says, I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old. And when I think about this, I think about hidden things. I don't think about secretive things. I think about things that are forgotten. And I think about things that in our lives at times we tend to forget what God has done in our lives. We tend to forget what God has done from one generation to the next. We tend to forget how God has moved. And for me, I love getting around older people, because older people have a lot of wisdom, and I just love what they have to share and have to say. And when I say older people, I mean elderly people. What is that age? You define it. I'm not going to define it. I don't want to get in trouble. Yeah, I'm trying to stay safe here, you know what I'm saying? Y'all have Bibles in your hand. You might throw it at me, you know what I'm saying? Like a boomerang. So whatever older is, but I did run into this older gentleman yesterday in the store, and I'm kind of in his way, and I said, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. And he says, oh, don't worry about it. I'm not in a hurry. And I was like, man, I got to learn something from this guy. Because I almost pushed him out the way, you know what I'm saying? Just kidding. I'm like, and I'm like, hey. So I told him, I'm like, man, where did you learn that? And he's like, what? I said, patience, like not to be in a hurry. He's like, you got a lot of life ahead of you, young man. And he just like, he cruised around. Like, it's almost like he did it on purpose. But I know part of it was his age, you know what I'm saying? And he kind of just went around like that. He's like, have a good day, young man. And I ran to the front of the, store because I wanted to get out of the store. I'm in a hurry. How many of you know we get in a hurry, right? Anyway, but we get around older people. One of those older people, some of you might know her by name. Her name was Sister Montoya. She passed away a few years ago. And I love her, and I love her memory. And I love one of the memories I have with her was, she was already older, and she invited me over to breakfast. And I was like, yeah. And she, of course, there's green chili, and there's papas, and there's eggs, fried eggs, fresh. Come on, Jesus. Anybody else feeling the Spirit? Okay, all right. But I want to know about the history. I want to know about stories. I want to know about how God has moved, because ultimately when we get into this text, we see, I will utter hidden things from of old. And I don't think it's just hidden things or secretive things. It's things that we've forgotten. And when we forget what God has done, we forget what God can do. But when we're reminded of what God has done, we're reminded of how he can move in and through our lives and what he'll do moving forward. And so getting around her, I'm like, I want to hear the stories. And she shared a few of them. But instead of me doing it justice, Pastor Josh, I'm going to bring you up here again. Let's welcome Pastor Josh as he shares a couple of stories. Because Sister Montoya was his grandma. And I know he's looking kind of old, but he's not that old.
Ancient. My back hurts. I'm sure I'm embellishing a little, but it's fun, and we're in a church, so it's okay to. No, I'm just kidding. No, the two stories that we talked about earlier was my grandma had a lot of kids. She had 11 children. That's not common today. But I'm not sure if all 11 were in the house at the time or alive at the time, but not alive like dead, like not born yet. I'm not sick. All right. So anyway, so they didn't have any breakfast, and they were hungry. And so Grandma asked everybody to pray, and are you tearing up, Mom? You got to stop it. You're going to make me cry. Hashtag not cool, Shar. All right. So anyways, it's fine. Marty too, man. My Aunt Marty's getting me too. So anyways, so she said to pray. And they're like, okay. So they all start praying, and an hour, I think, or a long time goes by, and one of the oldest boys, Hobie, was like, I am sick of praying. I was hungry an hour ago. I'm even more hungry now. I'm out of here. And he storms out of the living room and somehow goes outside, and underneath the porch, there's a nest with enough eggs for them to have breakfast. And much, I guess, later on, to get in the same situation, to get an idea also of the time, my grandpa pastored churches that were very small and very poor, very agrarial, right, agricultural. I have a book that says the tithe he received for the month from the church was $1.17. Now, obviously, they got eggs and corn and other things like that, but, I mean, that just was the time and where they were ministering. And then so they don't have breakfast, or they don't have a meal, and they start praying again, and, dang it, Mom, and I'm not, but that's weird, right? It's like, so this is what happened. So my grandma says, okay, we're going to pray. And they all kneel, and they're praying. And once again, Uncle Ho gets fed up, sick of this. I don't know if he said, like, it happened once, it's not happening a second time. Storms out, but in the middle of the storm, they hear a knock on the door. And so they open the door, and there's this woman. Says, I don't know what's going on, but a while ago, God told me to go to the store and pick up some food, and he told me to drive here, and he had like over $100 worth of groceries so that the family could eat. And that's the type of stories that I love, because it's those generations. It's Grandpa laying on your car, Tia, so that you guys can have gas to get home. I mean, there's just so many incredible things where God has done amazing things, and we need to share that with the next generation.
And all I would say to that is, if God can do it with some eggs and a couple bags of groceries, he can do it. And if it was done back then, he could do it now with any situation that we're going through. God is a God of provision. Amen. That's who he is. And so it says, I will open my mouth and utter a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old. It goes on to read, and as we do it, it really paints this amazing picture for us as we continue on this morning. Verse 3, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. And so they're going off the memory of what God has done, the things that we've heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. Verse 4, it says, we will not hide them from their descendants. In other words, we will not hide from the future generations the good things that God has done in past generations. We will make it known. And I want it to be known of what God has done in my life, and I want it to be known of what God has done in the lives of generations that came before me, because I know somewhere in southern Colorado in the 1800s, there was somebody that was kneeling down praying for me, and they didn't even know that some 100 plus years later I would be a pastor, right? But they believed, and they prayed. And so it says, things we have heard of and known, things our ancestors have told us, we will not hide them from their descendants, again, from future generations. In fact, it goes on to say this, we will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. We will tell of the praiseworthy deeds that the Lord has done, and the things that he has done in previous generations. We will tell of it. And I think about all the good things that God has done. I think about times in my life. I think about times in my family's lives. I think about friends of mine. I think about pastor friends of mine. I think about all the good things that God has done. And when I think about that, sometimes we tend to disqualify ourselves and say, well, God did it for them, but he can't do it for me. And I just want to say that the God of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God who came through the entire Old Testament into the New Testament and shows up in 2019. He's the same God that did it in Sister Montoya's life, and he's the same God that will do it in future generations from now. If God did it for somebody at some point in time, we can believe that God can do it for us. Verse 5, he decreed statutes of for Jacob and established the law in Israel. which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children. And so not only do they talk about the praiseworthy deeds of God, not only do they talk about the miracles and the miraculous and how God has showed up and what he's done, but they also say this second thing, which is teach them the truths of the Word of God. Teach them to follow the statutes, the commandments. And there's a whole lot that goes into that. There's a whole lot of thought and teaching that goes into that. But at the end of the day, we not only want to hear about the God of the miracles, but we want to know his truths and follow them just as well. And so it says to teach them also. Verse 6, so the next generation, and this is key, so the next generation would know them, know what? That the next generation would know the truths of God, and that the next generation would know the works of God. And it's critical, parents and grandparents, it's critical that we bring our kids to faith early and often. And I wish that we can control them all of our lives, but at some day they're going to have to cross that faith bridge themselves. But if you've not led them to that faith bridge before, if you've not mapped it out for them, if you've not allowed them to look at the jump before, they may never make the jump. And so we need to bring our kids to faith early and often and let God work in them, because there's a day where they're going to have to decide for themselves. And I don't know what that day is going to look like for them. I know what it looked like for me. It looked like I was on the inside of a jail cell, and I was like, God, do you even exist? And he's like, son, I'm about to show you. And get ready, because put your seatbelt on, because the next 23 years of your life are going to be absolutely amazing, and you will not know what I will do in your life, but just believe. I'm thankful that he got a hold of me in that situation. So the next generation will know them, again, the deeds and the truths. And then here's the thing, it goes on. And even the children yet to be born. That's it. So not only would they know it, but then even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children, and from one generation to the next, God would move and work, and it would continue on in such a way that God would move from one generation to the next. And I don't care what it might look like on the outside. I don't care what we might feel on the inside. God is a God that works from one generation to the next, and even when we don't see it and don't feel it, we can declare it, God, work in the next generation. Work in my children. And prophetically, I'm speaking one day my grandchildren. I'm not ready for that yet. But one day, I speak that over my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. If the Lord so tarries that there would be future generations, they may forget my name, but they would say, hey, wasn't your great-great-great-grandfather a pastor, a man of God, a man of integrity? Yes, he was. What's his name? I forgot. But what I do know is that because he prayed and because he had a woman next to his side that was a prayer warrior, that we are here today reaping the benefits of previous generations. And then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds and would keep his commands. Again, these two things, the works of God and the commands of God. Then they would put their trust in God. And they would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal to God and whose spirits were not faithful to him. You see, when Asaph wrote this first 8 verses of the book of Psalm 78, or the chapter of Psalm 78. And he spoke of this previous generation that was rebellious, whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful. He knew that the generation that heard him, the generation that was in that moment of public worship with him, whether they sang it or simply taught it, he knew, and that generation knew exactly what it was for a rebellious generation before them. A generation who was brought out of Egypt and to the footstep of the promised land, but because of their disloyalty to God, because of their rebellion, they didn't experience the promise of God. And I don't want to be like that generation. I don't want to get to the promised land and say, God, maybe, and what if, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to back off. I'm going to run forward, and if God is with us, who can be against us? And we're going to go forward, and we're going to say, God, we believe you, we believe you. And so as we prepare to wrap up today, we're dreaming and developing something for the future. Something that one day future generations will be blessed because of it. In fact, there's a time coming when there's a generation who will come after us. You see, this building didn't exist in the 70s. There was a pastor who drove by, saw a couple acres of land and said, you know what, let's buy the land and let's build a church. That pastor wasn't even the pastor who would build the church, he just bought the land. Later on, a generation came and they built this building, and I'm telling you, there's a future generation one day who they will run and walk in a building that is yet to be built, and they will declare the praise of God because of what he did in this generation. And so, we're dreaming for something in the future. Our dream is about blessing a future generation. Children who will come after us. If my family so chooses to make Grand Junction their future home forever, meaning my ancestors, my grandchildren will run in that building. I'll be gone. I'll be retired. Somebody else take the baton. Maybe one of my daughters will be the pastor of this church at that moment and in that season. And maybe with their husband, they will lead the next generation and a future generation. God can do it. I believe it. These girls have what it takes to lead this church in the future. Maybe it'll be my nephews. Maybe it'll be your daughter, your son, your grandson. I don't know. The point is this. Is there a future generation? We'll call a building yet to be built home. And they'll remember a generation that came before them. I want to go back to a video. I know it's a soft moment here, but I want to go back to a video of our 3D video of the building that we have proposed to build. And I want us to see it. And I want us to dream what it will look like as we see children run through that building. There's a direct box there. You could just hit the ground lift. It'll fix that. Here's the deal. Can you see it? Can you see it? One day a future generation will be living out our dream. We're existing in the dream of a previous generation. But one day, a generation after us will exist in our dream. We're on God's time frame, but the reality is this can be a very near future. What I've learned so far is that things of this nature, they don't come overnight. They come over a period of time. And again, I'm always in a hurry, right? But I know God is leading this. And so we're going to take things one step at a time. We're going to continue to trust God through the process. In fact, we already have, without even our plan set up, we already have our sewer and our water lines, our new sewer and our new water lines. We have some pictures of that. I don't know if they're available. And it doesn't seem like much, but when you go out to the building, I mean, I know it's kind of hard to see on these screens, but right here is a water line, and there's another one on this other side. It's for our domestic water, and then one for all of our we're going to have to bring in a second fire hydrant. We're going to have to bring in a fire suppression system, and so there's water there. Right there, there's our future sewer line. And it's just dirt, and it's just, you look at this and it's just dirt, and it's a mess, and the construction that was supposed to be over in 10 weeks is now taking 10 months. It feels like, not quite, it'll be over in December, thank God. That's the official word. So December, middle of December, we've got the word. And here's the thing, if it doesn't get done in December, we're waiting till the spring. So it's going to happen in December because that's right before the asphalt plants shut down. So it's going to happen. Amen? The thing about those pictures is that it may just be some dirt right now, just like this was just a pasture in the 70s. But one day, those taps are going to be connected to a building, and they're going to be connected to life-giving ministry that's happening right here on our campus. I believe it, and I know that God has a purpose for it. And so, as a takeaway today, let's keep this collective thought in mind. One day, a future generation will live out our dream. One day, a future generation will live out our dream. One day, God is going to allow that a future generation from now will live out our dream. Would you close your eyes with me for a second? Father, we thank you for your word, and we trust you for the future. For everyone that is here today, everyone watching online, I pray, God, that you would so speak to us about the dream, that a future generation will participate in because of what we're experiencing right here, right now. But if we're ever going to get there, we have to first commit our lives to you. We have to first engage in a personal relationship with you. And so, with every eye closed, if you're in this building and you say, I've yet to commit my life to Christ, or maybe you're saying, you know what, it's time, I've got to come back to Christ because I've wandered away. I've wandered away from his truth. This is God's time right now. Let's respect him. You say, I've wandered away from that truth. God wants to speak into your heart. And it's time to come home today. So if that's you, you say, I need to commit or recommit my life to Christ. All over this building, would you just raise your hand saying, that's me? God sees your hands. There's recommitment, commitment. God sees your hands. God sees your hands. And I'm going to ask everyone to pray this prayer with me. Everyone that's hearing the sound of my voice, would you pray a simple prayer with me? Would you say, Jesus, today, thank you for your grace. Save me. Teach me your ways. Remind me of your deeds. Remind me of your truth. And from this day forward, let me be a part of your dream for my life. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.